In the process of writing and recording music for their debut record, Ray and Dave Davies were listening to a ton of American music that was heavily inspired by the blues. Ray was really obsessed with the song Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, so he tried to write a song that was kind of similar, something called You Really Got Me, a simple story about seeing a girl in a club and not being able to reach her and then later lamenting that she really got him. It really can't be overstated what a wild time it would have been to be alive in the mid-60s in London, England. The innovation that was occurring with music at the time by these ambitious young British kids who were inspired by American blues would help shape music for the next 60 years.
The gramophone industry cashes in on the well-off teenagers to some tune. 80% of the disc output is bought by the youngsters. That's 50 million records a year in Britain alone.
And the Kinks played a crucial role in this process. Yes, I could be talking about overall influence and more abstract experimentation in terms of approach. Of course, there is no doubt that they were huge contributors in this regard, but this is the story of how Dave Davies' restlessness ended up influencing more than one generation to try something different. Dave was a great guitar player, and like most of the other kids in working class England at that time, he was mostly self-taught, informed only by his record collection and by what others around him were doing. The thing about music technology back then is it was very basic. An amplifier prior to 1964 was a very simple piece of equipment. The primary goal was to create the most clear, crisp sound that you possibly could, the true sound of the instrument. It was more than a decade earlier that American rhythm and blues artist Ike Turner and his band accidentally invented distortion when an amp fell out of the back of their car, falling to the ground, scraping up the speaker cone. They used this sound for the first time on their massively popular single Rocket 88, considered to be one of the first rock and roll songs. And over the next decade, American blues artists experimented with manipulating their amplifiers to create different variations of fuzzy sounds. These guys messed these amps up, trying to learn how sounds could be manipulated with slight alterations. Played a part in the development of the sound of distorted guitar that became an absolute staple in music in the 20th century. But even as the popularity of this raw sound grew, the equipment that young musicians had access to was very primitive. So in 1964, 17-year-old Dave Davies braved a sound that he had heard on an American blues record by a band called The Ventures. The Ventures were an instrumental rock band who sought the sound out themselves from a record by country rockabilly artist Grady Martin, who played on a record by Marty Robbins called Don't Worry. Grady had also come across the sound accidentally when his faulty preamp created this fuzzy tone. So it's like this sound, this distorted guitar, something that everybody wanted, but very few had the knowledge to create it. And most people stumbled upon it accidentally. Dave Davies wanted the sound too, so he went and bought a cheap amplifier from the shop.
Well, we had that sound like 6 months before we recorded, before You Really Got Me was around. I can remember searching. I've always been a person that couldn't sit still. Experiment with the guitar, but the guitar sounds are very limited. They're just tone control, volume. That was about it. I came across this little amp in the shop called an El Pico, and I think it was like a 5-inch. I just got a razor blade, and I started to cut the cone of the speaker. I don't know why. And I cut it all the way around, but it was still intact. I plugged it in, and it made that amazing sound.
You Really Got Me was in no way meant to sound the way that it ended up sounding when Ray originally wrote it. He was a great songwriter right from the beginning, but he had ambitions to be more of a bluesy band, something that sounded more along the lines of Fats Domino and Ain't That a Shame. They recorded the song with the limited amount of studio time that they were afforded, listened to it, and hated it. Something was wrong. It lacked the power and the intensity that the song deserved, and the Davies brothers knew it. The studio engineer almost did not let them re-record it. He thought that they had wasted enough time and he was more than over it with these two diva brothers. But Ray pushed for it and they were allowed to record the song one more time. And perhaps because desperate times call for desperate measures, Dave Davies pulled a trick out of his sleeve. He brought out the little messed up amplifier that he and Ray had used in their front living room, plugged in his guitar, and The riff was a take on Mannish Boy by Muddy Waters. But it sounds a little bit more urgent, a little more desperate. For good measure, he also played the guitar solo with a kind of wild freedom that lacked any technical ability, any clarity whatsoever. This style was recognizably Dave Davies, inventive and pure in its distinction, and the influence that this song had on everybody else at the time was immeasurable. Pete Townsend was listening, so were Jimi Hendrix and Keith Richards. This was far from I Wanna Hold Your Hand. After the success of You Really Got Me, the Kinks had found a place in the industry. Ray had found his lyrical voice. It was one that was a little bit more blatantly sexualized than everybody else at the time. Dave also found himself with the distortion sound that he'd be credited with helping popularize. And the two of them would combine those forces. Dave got his guitar to sound even more gritty than it had before. Ray created lyrics that were even more outrightly sexual than they had been before. And the band just overall sounded more confident, more sure of themselves, as a definitive part of this growing British invasion scene. So the Kinks are recording all day and all of the night, and it's 10 o'clock in the morning because the band have a scheduled show that evening. The song was recorded in just 3 hours, and right when Dave was recording his iconic solo, this up-and-coming session musician at the time called Jimmy Page walks in the room, snickering at the informality and lack of technical skill in the solo. When asked about it later, Jimmy Page claimed that he played the solo himself on the record as a hired musician for the Kinks. Good old Jimmy up to his usual hijinks. Anyways, this wasn't even the only issue of contention with All Day and All of the Night. A few years later, the Doors would come out with a song called Hello, I Love You. It was a huge hit for them at the time, and the Kinks manager thought that the chord progression sounded strangely similar. He insisted that Ray sue the Doors for royalties. Ray's initial response was that he just wanted the band to own up to the inspiration. He didn't think it was necessary to take legal action. Jim Morrison admitted he was a huge fan of the Kinks, as anyone was who knew anything about popular music, so it was very likely that he was inspired by the song. Robbie Krieger, however, denies this claim, saying that the riff was composed as inspired by Sunshine of Your Love by Cream. Because apparently it was cooler to give credit to Eric Clapton than it was to Ray Davies. Typical.